Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. British Prime Minister Theresa May is running out of time to avoid the Brexit cliff edge. Her proposals for a post-Brexit trade deal with Brussels got short shrift from the EU's chief negotiator. She seems to be hoping to get more joy from some of Europe's national leaders. But with every passing day, the prospect of a no-deal, potentially chaotic Brexit grows more real. My guest is the Dutch MEP, Sophie Int Veld, who is deputy to the European Parliament's chief Brexit negotiator. Is Brexit brinkmanship a game no one can win? Sophie Int Veld in Brussels, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hello.
You follow the Brexit negotiations very, very closely. Are you comfortable with the fact that when Theresa May and her government came out with their big proposal, the so-called white paper, their vision for what a post-Brexit trade deal with the EU could look like, it was effectively dismissed by the EU Commission's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, with barely a second glance?
Well, dismissed. I think Mr. Barnier made it very clear that we are happy that there are proposals on the table. That's a start. That's necessary. He also made it very clear that some of the proposals clearly, do not fit in or do not correspond to the rules of the internal market, but there's clearly a basis to start the talks and hopefully finalize the talks on time and try and avoid a cliff edge scenario.
Well, you say there's clearly a basis for talks. I'm struggling to see that basis because Michel Barnier, from the very beginning of this process up to the present day, appears convinced that Britain is still, to use the phrase always wheeled out by the Commission, cherry-picking, trying to have its cake and eat it. All of those cliches we've been hearing for the last 18 months, they're still being used in Brussels.
Well, there are lots of cliches being used on all sides. The reality is that we have to sit down and try and come to an agreement, more or less by October. That is the reality. I think on the side of the European Union, contrary to what some of the media are reporting, there is a lot of goodwill. People do want a result, but clearly there are limits. What we are not going to do is renegotiate the rules of the internal market or the European Union.
But when Michel Barnier says with scepticism, the UK, and this is a quote from him, the UK seems to want to keep free movement of goods between us, but not of people and services, as though, in his view, there's an indivisibility to those different pillars of the EU's single market, and that he will not accept any effort to make a difference between goods and services. Are you with him or not?
Well, it's not his view. It's a fact. That is the way the internal market was built. And what strikes me in this whole debate, and also the way that it's been displayed in the UK media, or at least to the extent that I've seen it, is that the UK, for 45 years, has been one of the main champions of the internal market, one of the prime architects of the internal market. So you know what the rules of the game are because you were actually leading the construction of the internal market. So I think it's a bit strange to now say, but we can sort of unpick it and try and select the bits that we like, because that's not the way that it works.
But why not think creatively? Why not actually consider the possibility that a little bit of unpicking, as you put it, of the rules might actually be productive, not just for one side, but for both sides, that rather than this be a lose-lose, it might end up being a win-win? I mean, a respected economic analyst in the Financial Times recently, Martin Sandu, said, look, let's get real. Yes, it's complicated, this white paper. Yes, the British government will probably have to make some more concessions. But in essence, he says, you know, the EU, this is a quote from him, the EU promises to treat the UK as a third country, a third party after Brexit, so it should, by standing ready to accept an improved Chequers white paper offer, and then declaring a resounding victory. He's basically saying there's a lot in the white paper that the EU, if it would only get away from a sort of puritanical stance, should actually regard as good news.
Well, what you call puritanical, I would actually call, let's say, the rule of law. We have treaties, and you know, I believe that when you sign up to a treaty, you have to respect the terms of the treaty until people decide to change the treaty. But until we do that, we have the internal market, we have the EU treaties. This is a rules-based entity, if you want. And again, the UK has been one of its prime architects. So, and I think this is not, you know, we're not starting from scratch here. The UK, which is still a member of the European Union, has chosen to leave the European Union. I am one of those who regrets that, but you know, the British people in majority have decided to leave the European Union. So now we have to make sure that there's an orderly withdrawal, and we have to limit the damage as much as possible.
Right, but I'm just trying.
And then we have to discuss the future relationship.
But compromise can't all be one way.
What we are not. No, but there's no compromise. The UK is leaving the EU. So where's the compromise? You wanted to leave, or the majority wanted to leave.
If I may say so, it seems to me the compromise comes in finding a deal and a process for that leaving of the EU, which does least damage to both sides. That's where the compromise comes in, and that's where you may have to be a little bit creative about these rules that you regard as so very important.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's ironic that the Brits, who actually, you know, were pushing the internal market, building the internal market, are now reproaching the European Union for actually protecting the internal market. For us, the integrity of the internal market is very, very important, and I think that's also our interest in the future. They have made their choice. You know, this is what the Tory party, or at least large part of the Tory party, wanted. And I think it's not for us now to solve the problems of the Tory party. It is actually for politicians on all sides, including in the UK, to start being honest. And the whole idea that you can have a Brexit and you can cherry pick and then Brexit, this whole, you know, people are using a sentence, we're going to make Brexit a success. Why aren't they honest to people and say there is no such thing as a successful Brexit? Because it will always hurt, and it's going to hurt lots of people, but it will hurt primarily people in the United Kingdom, and I find that very sad. So what they should do is not expect the European Union to undo the EU and the internal market. What they have to do is being honest to their own voters.
No, but there is a sense in which, with your stance, and some would describe it as intransigent. I know you reject that, but your absolute insistence on the laws and the process that the EU has established, you risk a form of mutually assured destruction, don't you? Because yes, a chaotic, cliff edge, crash out Brexit is going to be undeniably very damaging to the UK economy, but it's equally going to be very damaging to economies across the European Union, not least the Netherlands economy. If you would only show some flexibility, you could avoid some of that damage to yourself.
Well, actually, I think my voters, because you were talking about politics and elections, my voters expect us to protect the integrity of the internal market, because in the long term, that is what will actually assure our prosperity. And I think, you know,
don't
this
your
blame
voters
game,
expect you to protect their jobs? And you are going to, in the Netherlands, lose many tens of thousands of jobs, according to the IMF, because of what will come with a hard Brexit.
Look, this is all part of a kind of panicky blame game. Brexiteers understanding that Brexit is not going to take them into heaven, and they're trying to blame it now on others, saying, you know, Brexit is a really good idea, but it's being badly executed because, you know, those Europeans are so intransigent. No, Brexit was never a good idea. It was always going to hurt. We have to limit the damage. But in the long term, the prosperity of the European Union and jobs in the European Union depend on the integrity of the internal market, and we're not going to unpick it.
But I come back to just some raw data that's been put out by the IMF. Of course, it's a little bit speculative, but, you know, one has to respect the strength of their economics. They say if there is a cliff edge, a hard crash-out Brexit, That will cost the EU as a whole probably around 1.5%, if not more, of GDP. Some countries much worse, like Ireland, could be 4% of GDP. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of jobs, possibly over 1 million across the European Union as a whole. And some countries in particular, and this is where we get to you, some countries in particular, like the Netherlands, are extraordinarily vulnerable because of the strength of your trading relationship with the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but we also have trading relations with the EU internal market. And I think if you make the same calculation for the disintegration of the internal market, you would get figures that are even worse. And I think to now one-sidedly try and make the EU responsible for the fallout of Brexit is a bit the world on its head. Look, there were politicians, you referred to Boris Johnson earlier and some other politicians who have really behaved like populists. They have told people that Brexit was going to be, Brexit was going to bring them heaven. That was simply never true. Brexit was always going to hurt. And it depends on two sides, but certainly also the UK side. Because let's not forget, the vote took place over 2 years ago. Only now we have the white paper with some concrete proposals on the table. It's always been a problem, an internal problem of the Tory party, and it wasn't. I don't think that this is what David Cameron had in mind when he called for the referendum.
Let me ask you this, if I may. I mean, you're sitting there in Brussels, and obviously, you follow this process very closely. But the British government appears to have changed tack in recent days. Obviously the Commission is by and large on its summer holidays. So Theresa May and Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt are going round capitals, talking to leaders and foreign ministers across Europe, trying to tell them, look, there is a looming tragedy. This is Jeremy Hunt's words. There is a looming tragedy here. If the UK does crash out of the EU without a deal, according to Mr. Hunt, that will be terribly damaging to the EU as well as Britain, and in his words, a tragedy. Now, it just strikes me that some national leaders, worried about employment and the state of their own economies, might be much more receptive to that message than Michel Barnier, and maybe you.
Well, Mr. Barnier is negotiating on behalf of the EU, and he has the support of the member states. That is very clear. None of the member states has said, he's not speaking on behalf of my country.
Well, that's true. They haven't said that. But if I may, some member states like Malta, like Italy, like Austria, have suggested that there should be a focus on trying to find compromise.
But look, everybody is open to a compromise, but a compromise can never, ever include the disintegration of the internal market. The integrity of the internal market is not on the agenda of the negotiations. That must be very clear.
Is there an element of bluff in all of this? I noticed the Netherlands has made a very public announcement that 1,000 new customs officers are being trained to deal with the potential fallout from a no-deal Brexit. I know there's discussion in the Netherlands about what it will mean for the agriculture sector and other sectors that will be most affected. Is the Netherlands government really now thinking no deal will happen, or is there an element of bluff to all of this on both sides of the English Channel?
I don't think there's any bluff here. I mean, we've been very clear about our position. It's not, is not rocket science. We are the European Union. We have the internal market. We will negotiate with the UK about our future relationship, but we will not renegotiate the EU because, yes, Brexit will be damaging, even if there is no cliff edge, crashing out of the EU. If there is crashing out of the EU, it will be even more damaging. But unpicking the internal market will be the worst scenario of all, and that we're not going to do. If you say bluff, because I've noticed that in recent weeks in the British media, lots of and you're actually making the same points here, trying to kind of intimidate the European Union into, if you don't accept our terms, then it will be terrible for you. I think we should be, maybe it is time for a little bit of honesty in politics, and maybe people should have been told before the Brexit referendum what reality was going to be like. Now, the vote has taken place. That's very clear. That's the situation we have to deal with. And it will hurt, but we are not going to undo the internal market.
Well, far be it from me to intimidate anybody. I'm just looking at the reality of what is happening, not just actually in terms of economics, but also in terms of security. Because
no, I think talking about reality, I think what's happening is that reality is sinking in now, even with those like Boris Johnson who have been promoting Brexit.
Well,
and they're trying now. They're trying to put the blame on somebody else. But if they were honest, and if they were, I think they should kind of man up and take responsibility for what they have.
I'm just trying
achieved.
to switch focus a little bit onto security issues. You say, there's absolutely foursquare unity amongst all the 27 members of the EU as they approach the Brexit problem. But on the security issue, there clearly isn't complete unity. We had Germany's Interior Minister Horst Seehofer saying recently that he believes it is vital that the UK is kept in the various different security structures that involve it in so much of the important work concerning policing and security across Europe. That's a very different message from Michel Barnier, and again suggests to me that in some capitals in Europe, there is a grave concern about what a no-deal Brexit would mean in security terms for the rest of Europe.
Look, but of course there's grave concern anywhere, also in the European Parliament. The point is, I understand what Mr. Seehofer wants to say, but I think he said it the wrong way. The fact that we will want to have very close cooperation with the UK, I think, is undisputed. Everybody wants that, but we have to look very carefully at the terms. It is clear that we cannot, the UK will not be a part of the European Union anymore, so it cannot be part of EU institutions. That's clear. That should not prevent us from having close cooperation, having exchange of information, but clearly then there also have to be agreements on, legal safeguards, data protection, fundamental rights, right to fair trial, all the regular safeguards that you have and that we need to negotiate.
A quick final thought on Brexit then, before I broaden this discussion out a little bit. There is a growing sense among some policymakers in Europe that what will actually happen, rather than a crash, no-deal Brexit, there will be yet another moment of fudge and kicking the can down the road come this autumn and early spring of next year. It seems a feeling that the two sides won't be able to do much more than establish a withdrawal agreement, and only the very broadest notion of where they might go in terms of a future trading relationship. And most of the detail will be left off any document, and there will be a transition agreement. And during those 2 years or so, the hope is somehow they will get to a consensual agreement. Is that what's going to happen in the long run?
Look, I haven't got a crystal ball, and there is no, there's no map, there is no blueprint. We're in uncharted territory. We don't know. All I can hope for is that we will find agreement, hopefully on time by October. And I think, contrary to what was suggested earlier, the European Union, we're united and very open to compromise. That does not entail renegotiating the basis of the EU, but we are open to compromise. Everybody, I think, is aware of the seriousness of the situation and the urgent need to find solutions on time.
Before we end, I do want to broaden this out, and it's interesting to me that throughout this interview you've stressed the unity of the EU 27, but it seems to me in a way Brexit is a distraction from the much bigger challenge facing the European Union right now, which is that there is a growing strain of populist nationalism rife right across Europe, from Italy in Western Europe to Hungary, Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And it is a movement which is challenging the basic sort of notions of European sovereignty in a way that goes far beyond Brexit. Would you agree?
Well, yes. And actually, I think European integration isn't even at the top of their political agenda. They clearly have an agenda which is much more focusing on issues like values, like equality, pluralism, the basic rules of democracy. It's a very authoritarian strand of populism, very nationalist.
If I may say so, it's a strand which is all about the nation state and the power and importance of the nation state. So when it comes to profound EU challenges like a common approach to migration, or indeed the future of the Eurozone, because let's face it, that hasn't been sorted out satisfactorily. When it comes to those pan-European challenges, there is no coherence anymore to the EU at all.
Actually, no, that's not true, because the anti-EU nationalists are not the majority. I also see that the pro-European forces are being mobilized because they're beginning to realize that they have to act. And I would also like to stress that, yes, the European Union, we are not, we have a way of doing things. It's always about compromise, consensus. It's a bit slow. It's not very sexy and heroic, the way that we take decisions. But if you look at what the European Union has gone through over the last 10 years or so, an economic crisis, refugees, terrorism. Now we have to deal with a world run by people like Trump, Putin. We are facing Brexit. And you know what? The European Union is still there. It's strong. It hasn't fallen apart. And popular support is growing.
No doubt the European Union is still there, but whether it's coherent is another matter. I mean, in a sense, the most powerful political figure in Europe right now, in some ways, is Emmanuel Macron in France. Now, he's got a very strong vision of deepening European sovereignty, but frankly, most other European leaders are not there anymore. The integrationist impulse is over, and even your own Prime Minister in Holland, responding to Macron, said integration for integration's sake will only harm future public support for the European Union. So when you tell me there's a clear direction of travel, there isn't.
It's never been integration for integration's sake, never. It's always been integration in order to respond to the challenges of today. And reality is, of course, that the nation state or the national state in itself cannot respond anymore to the challenges of today. We need a strong European Union. I see that support for European integration amongst young people, that is, the next generation of leaders, is very strong. They're becoming more engaged, more active, more mobilized. So actually, I'm quite
frankly,
optimistic.
If one looks at Brexit as an example, all one can say is that there are increasing deep divisions between demographics, different age groups right across Europe. That isn't necessarily helping European Union. But a final thought. The guy you work very closely with, Guy Verhofstadt in the European Parliament, says actually Brexit is a sign of failure. It has to be accepted inside the EU as a failure for the EU and part of a bigger picture which is relevant to what we've just been discussing. Would you accept that?
Well, I think, in political terms, I don't know, but I would personally feel it as a sense of failure as well. At the same time, it's also serving as a wake-up call. I think both in the UK and in the European Union. I think Trump is another wake-up call, and we have a few others, like Putin. But I think the wake-up call is working, actually. People are being mobilized. They are speaking up. Support for the European Union is growing. And it's never been a linear
that message
process.
Of yours is as valid and coherent in Budapest, in Warsaw, and in Rome as it is sitting there in Brussels?
Yes, I think so, because you can see everywhere, and of course in one country it will be stronger than in another. But I actually think, it's not so much the European Union that's in trouble. It's the nation state, which is much weaker now in times of globalization, in the digital age where, state power is territorial power. But in the digital era, what is territorial power? So we can see, it's an open world. And we can see that it's actually the nation state struggling with these challenges, whereas the European Union is actually growing stronger and has much better answers for the future.
All right, well, we have to end there, but Sophie Int Veld, I thank you very much for joining me on Hard Talk. Thank you.
My pleasure.